And thanks for the invitation. I'm here on behalf of the Institute of Employment Rights and the Campaign for Trade Union Freedom. And I'd like to just offer a few reflections, I think, on proceedings tonight. And the first of these is to recall why we are here in the first place, and to remember the debt that we all owe to the Tolpuddle martyrs. And just by way of background, I think just to pick up on some of the points that Nigel made in his introduction, I think just to go back to recall that the Sikhs formed a union. The union was known at the time as the Friendly Society of Agricultural Labourers, with its Grand Lodge to be located in Tolpuddle. And the reason for this action by the Sikhs was the decision by their employers to cut their wages from what was then 10 shillings or 50 pence today to 7 shillings or roughly 35 pence today a week. Now, that would equate to about a cut from, say, £60 to £40 a week at today's prices, or today's rates, taking into account inflation and all the rest of it since then. Now, the Webbs, in their famous history of trade unionism, which was published in 1920, they tell us that in cutting the wages of the Sikhs, the employers were acting in breach of an agreement which had been solemnly concluded in the presence of the village parson at Tolpuddle. And for taking the action of joining the union and for coming together in this way, the Sikhs were then charged under what was then called the Unlawful Oaths Act of 1797. So it's a fairly obscure statute which had been dragged up to be used against these 6 Dorchester labourers. Well, they were then marched off to Dorchester, where they were convicted for their trade union activities after a trial before a hostile court. And again, if we go back to the Webbs for their account of the trial, the Webbs tell us that the judge addressed the grand jury on the case at portentous length, as if the prisoners had committed murder or treason, and inflicted on them, after the briefest of trials, the monstrous sentence of 7 years transportation. So the men were convicted on the 18th of March, 1834. By the 30th of March, they were in the prison ships, and by the 15th of April, it was announced in Parliament that 5 of them were already on their way to Botany Bay. And George Lovelace, the 6th, he went later and ended up in Port Arthur on the southeast tip of Tasmania, which is probably as far away from Tolpuddle as it is possible to be at the time. And the penal colony at Tasmania, I mean, just incidentally, the Lovelace's location, George Lovelace's location, it is still there. So the penal colony has been preserved, and the house which Lovelace occupied is still there. It's on the hill in the colony, which was preserved for political prisoners. It wasn't just the Tolpuddle martyrs who were transported to Australia for their political views. There were other people at the time, but Lovelace was one of them, and his location of exile is still there for all to see. To continue with the story, I think important, I mean, as Nigel pointed out, the Sikhs did not serve their full term. They returned to England in 1836 after they'd been pardoned by the then Home Secretary. And this pardon was in response to a well-organized political campaign of protest and activism, which, if we go back to the Webbs, they tell us that the protest was on such a scale that special constables had to be sworn in to help police the activities. Troops were deployed to London in order to prevent an uprising, which the government of the day feared. And I think the campaign was all the more impressive for the fact that this was taking place at a time when workers did not have the vote, to go back to the earlier discussion about electoral politics, and that they had no opportunity to mobilize electoral pressure on the government. They relied on the raw power of mass protest to reveal their hostility, invoke fear, and produce change. And faced with this popular resistance, a worried government backed down. The justice of political protest displaced the injustice of the law. And I think there is a lesson to learn from that experience. So the second point, apart from just focusing on the and recalling the events which led us to where we are today, I think the second question to raise is, well, why is this still significant? Well, why should we be doing this today, almost 200 years later? Why is it still relevant? And I think the answer to that is that because the context, it's true that the context has changed greatly in 200 years, but I think the fundamentals remain largely the same. And in that sense, I think Tolpuddle, it's almost an allegory. It's a story that helps to illuminate many modern truths, and for that reason should never be forgotten. And the first of these truths is the truth of employer power. Now, it is true that we no longer have our agreements negotiated in the presence of the village parson. We rely now on the law of contract to strike a solemn agreement with our employer. But as we've seen recently, employers are free to change these contractual terms at will. They can cut your pay, reduce your holidays, decide to remove a shift premium. We call this fire and rehire. If you don't like it, you can always bring a claim for unfair dismissal in our highly sophisticated legal system. But you will fail because the employment tribunal will tell you that it's not unfair for the employer to take these steps, to refuse, not unfair to dismiss you because you refuse to accept a pay cut from £60 to £40 a week or its modern day equivalent. It is not unfair. Fire and rehire does not give rise to a remedy for unfair dismissal. So things are better today than they were in 1834, but the legacy of Tolpuddle still survives in its visual expression of this power of the employer, which remains. And the second point, I think, which is worth emphasizing, the second point in relation to why Tolpuddle continues to be relevant, is that it's true that we no longer prosecute trade unionists for administering or taking secret oaths. And it's also true that we don't transport those who do to New South Wales or to Tasmania. But we continue to penalise trade unionists and to punish trade unions for similar acts of loyalty and solidarity. In recent times, certainly in my lifetime, we've witnessed blacklisting and victimization, discrimination and dismissal, injunctions, fines and sequestration, prosecution and conviction, the use of infiltration and informers by the state. And in the Shrewsbury case, perhaps countless others which are unknown, we've seen miscarriages of justice as a result of government collusion with the legal system. Again, things are better, but the legacy of Tolpuddle survives. And then the third lesson, I think, from Tolpuddle is the lesson about the power of protest. What led to the pardons and to the return of the Tolpuddle martyrs was not legal action. Nobody was waiting for the election of a Labour government. It was direct action by workers themselves, including, again, to use, going back to the webs, including a monstrous procession of trade unionists. And that episode, I think, illuminated the reality of what causes governments to change is the fear of countervailing power, the fear that the government has lost support, lost the support of the country, the fear that has lost control of events, the fear of the void and uncertainty that is created as a result. And as those who fought for the return of the martyrs also revealed, that power needs to be organized. It's not enough that that power is latent. What the success of Tolpuddle, the success of the Tolpuddle Martyrs campaign revealed, I think, is that that latent power has to be roused. It needs to be organized and it needs to be mobilized. And that, I think, is a real lesson of the success of the return of the six. So that, I think, is a challenge. I mean, it's a lesson, but it's also a challenge for modern trade unionism at a time when I think our fortunes are at a pretty low ebb, in the sense that the challenge now is how do we rouse, how do we organize, and how do we mobilize that power which would enable us to resist much more effectively than has been the case hitherto. So let me conclude by saying that although we have come a long way since 1834, I think in some respects we have not traveled very far. We've much to learn from those who, in solidarity with the six, fought successfully for their release. And although I don't underestimate how hard it is to rouse, organize, and mobilize, it cannot have been easier. It cannot have been easier in 1834 than it would be today. Thank you very much.